The desert at night is a quiet place, far from the noise of Las Vegas. The Nevada sky stretches endlessly, scattered with cold pinpricks of starlight. The air is still, carrying only the faint hum of insects and the soft rustle of sand shifting with the breeze. Out here, in the open expanse, time seems to move differently, lower, calmer, as though the world itself is holding its breath. It was in this stillness, in the forgotten edges of the Nevada test site, that whispers began. Whispers about things that couldn't quite be explained. Strange lights dancing in the sky. Unmarked aircraft that moved in ways physics shouldn't allow. And, eventually, whispers about a man who would change how the world talked about Area 51 forever. But that comes later. For now, imagine that desert night. The highway is empty, the occasional car a distant echo across the flats. If you stopped along the roadside, turned off your headlights, and stepped out into the open air, you'd hear almost nothing. Just silence, broken now and then by the faint whine of something. Was it a jet or something else, moving silently beyond the ridges? This is the setting where the story of Bob Lazar begins. In the late 1980s, Area 51 was still more rumor than reality. The base existed, yes, but it was officially denied a name, whispered among aviation enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists, but never acknowledged by those who worked in its shadows. Most people didn't think much about it at all. The Cold War had its own fears, its own distractions, but then a soft-spoken man with a background in science appeared on a local Las Vegas news program, his face hidden, his voice altered. He called himself Dennis at first, and what he claimed would ignite one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern era. He said he worked there, not just at the test site, but at a hidden facility south of the main base, a place called S4. And what he saw there, he said, would change the way we thought about our place in the universe. Of course, no one knew then what to believe. Was it a hoax, a disinformation campaign, or the confession of a man too burdened by the weight of what he'd witnessed to keep silent? That's what we'll explore in this story. But first, let's stay in this quiet moment before the interviews, before the controversy, before the documentaries and debates. Let's imagine the Nevada desert as it was in those days, an expanse of dust and stone, guarded by distant mountain ranges that caught the last light of the sun before surrendering to the cool black night dot at the edges of Groom Lake. Motion detectors and armed patrols kept watch over miles of restricted land. Pilots testing advanced aircraft machines the public wouldn't see for another decade flickered across the skies at impossible speeds. But among those who lived nearby, among the curious who camped along the perimeter to catch a glimpse of those lights, there was already a sense that something more was happening, something not entirely human. And that is where Bob Lazar steps into the story, a man with a sharp mind, a quiet demeanor, and claims so extraordinary that even today, decades later, they stir heated debate. His story isn't just about spacecraft and strange materials. It's about secrecy, power, and the way a single voice can spark questions that never seem to fade. Whether you believe him or not, there's something about the Lazar story that pulls you in. Maybe it's the possibility that we aren't alone. Or maybe it's the quiet, unsettling thought that someone, somewhere, knows the truth and is keeping it hidden. Tonight, as you settle in, this is the story we'll explore together. slowly, calmly, in no rush. We'll trace the path from that first anonymous interview to the storm of attention that followed. We'll wander through the technical details Lazar shared, the investigations that sought to discredit him, and the strange coincidences that kept his story alive, even when others faded away. But above all, we'll return again and again to that quiet desert where the silence feels heavy and the stars seem closer than they should be, because that's where it began, with a man, a secret, and a sky full of questions. So take a breath. Let the noise of the day drift away. Imagine that still night air, the cool desert breeze, and the quiet hum of something distant, something just beyond what we can explain. And let's begin. The first night Bob Lazar drove out to the site, the desert felt different. He'd been in isolated places before, quiet stretches of land where you could drive for miles without passing another car, but this wasn't the same. This was heavier, quieter, like a place holding its breath. The government-issued badge on the passenger seat caught the dim glow of the dashboard lights. Even now, he found himself glancing at it, almost as though to reassure himself it was real. The black letters, the classified designation, everything about it felt official, almost intimidating. It wasn't the kind of thing you ever expected to see with your name on it, and yet there it was. Bob wasn't a stranger to advanced science or high-security work. He'd tinkered with jet engines in his own car, worked on particle accelerators, and pushed himself to understand systems most people never thought twice about. But this was different. They hadn't told him much, just a time, a pickup point, and instructions. Don't ask questions. Follow the protocol, and above all, don't talk. The drive was long. Miles of highway. Nothing but the faint reflection of road markers catching his headlights as he pushed deeper into the desert. Around him, the night stretched wide, filled with stars that didn't flicker the way city lights did. It was quiet, but not the comforting kind of quiet. This quiet felt watchful, like the desert itself knew something he did in single quotes T. When he reached the designated checkpoint, men in uniform waited. No small talk, no smiles, just clipped instructions, ID verification, and the subtle but unmistakable presence of armed security. Even then, a darkened transport vehicle took him the rest of the way. The windows were blacked out. No sense of direction, just the hum of the engine and the occasional faint jolt as they passed over uneven ground. Time blurred. He tried to keep track, estimating distances in his mind, but soon gave up. When they finally stopped and the door opened, the first thing he noticed was the smell. The desert air was still there, dry, cool, but beneath it was something sharper, metallic, almost antiseptic. The second thing was the silence. Even with activity around him, voices, footsteps, the distant hum of equipment, there was an eerie quietness, like every sound was dampened, absorbed by the walls of the place. The facility, he would learn, was called S4, tucked against a mountain ridge. It wasn't visible from the air, and even from the ground, you wouldn't have guessed it was there unless you knew exactly where to look. The entrance looked like part of the landscape, a natural slope leading to reinforced doors that seemed to vanish once closed. Inside, the world shifted. Sterile hallways, white walls, the kind of hum that comes from machines running somewhere beyond sight. As they guided him deeper, past layers of security, he tried to take everything in without drawing attention to himself. He'd learned early in life that it was better to observe first, speak later, and then, without warning, he saw it in a large, dimly lit bay, partially obscured by equipment and scaffolding, sat something that didn't belong, something smooth, metallic, and strangely small. The curve of it was almost elegant, but it was the texture that caught his eye. It wasn't painted, wasn't bolted together. It was seamless, as though it had been grown, not built. Bob slowed as they moved past it, his escort saying nothing, offering no acknowledgement of what he was seeing. He wanted to ask, to point, to demand some explanation. But the look on the guard's face, calm, impassive, with the kind of discipline that told you this wasn't the first time someone had been stunned into silence, stopped him. Later, in quiet moments, he would remember the way it looked under the lights, smooth, perfect, not a single seam, rivet, or weld, just a flawless curve of metal, reflecting the sterile glow of the bay-like liquid silver. That first night, they didn't tell him much. Orientation, paperwork, a few briefings filled with terms he half recognized but couldn't fully connect, talk of propulsion systems and reverse engineering, warnings about compartmentalization. Only know what they allowed him to know, but even with the secrecy, the message was clear. This wasn't human. Whatever it was, whatever it had been hadn't come from here. The drive back through the desert was quieter. He didn't bother trying to track the turns or the time. He just sat there, replaying what he'd seen. The image of that craft burned into his thoughts. It didn't feel real. None of it did. And yet, deep down, a part of him knew his life had just split into two parts. The part before S4 and the part after. In the days that followed, Bob would return again and again, each time allowed a little more access, a little more information. But that first night, that first glimpse, stayed with him. The silence, the quiet hum of something ancient, powerful, and not meant for human hands. And outside, beyond the mountains and fences and restricted airspace, the desert remained unchanged, still, silent, waiting. What the world didn't know yet was that this silence wouldn't last, because soon the whispers would begin, and when they did, nothing would ever be the same. Long before Bob Lazar's name became a quiet echo in late-night conversations and whispered debates, there were others. Men and women who had seen things they couldn't explain, strange lights, impossible movements, and moments that left them staring up at the desert sky, wondering what, exactly, was out there. The Nevada desert had always been a canvas for mysteries. Wide, empty expanses where the sky stretched endlessly, and where silence carried secrets no one could quite name. It was the kind of place where you could convince yourself that anything at all might be possible. One of the earliest witnesses was a man named Ed, a former Air Force radar operator. He never sought attention, never wanted headlines, but his story, told quietly to a friend over coffee in a small diner off Highway 375, had the same quiet weight to it that so many of these accounts carried. It had been late near midnight when the radar lit up with something unusual. No flight plans matched, no aircraft were scheduled to be in that sector. At first, he thought it was a glitch, some error in the system. But then the object moved, smoothly, precisely, covering distances in seconds that should have taken minutes, even for the fastest jets. It wasn't ours, Ed would say later, his voice steady but low, as though even years later The words carried a kind of risk. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't ours. Others saw lights, strange, hovering orbs that appeared in the distance, bright against the endless black of the desert night. They moved in ways nothing man-made could, darting sharply, holding still, then vanishing as though they'd never been there at all. In Rachel, Nevada, a town so small you could count its businesses on one hand, the sightings became something of a quiet routine. Locals learned to watch the sky without talking about it too much, to nod politely when someone new came into the diner and asked if anyone had seen something strange. A woman named Carla remembered one night in particular. She'd been closing up her small shop, locking the door, when a soft glow caught her eye. Out past the edge of town, over the ridge that shielded the restricted airspace, something was moving. It wasn't fast, not the way jets move, but steady, deliberate, like it knew exactly where it was going. It didn't make a sound, she said, her hands stilling for a moment as she recalled it. Not a single sound. And then, like someone flipped a switch, it was gone. People like Carla didn't go to the authorities. Around here, you didn't. You learned to keep your head down, to go on with your life. And if, on a quiet night, you found yourself staring up at the sky a little longer than usual, well, that was your business. Then there were the test pilots, men trained to push aircraft to their limits, to handle speed and altitude in ways few could imagine. They didn't scare easily, and they didn't exaggerate, but even they had stories, brief glimpses of something metallic flashing by. Radar locks on objects that vanished before visual confirmation, and a nagging sense that someone, or something, was always just one step ahead. One pilot, who would only speak anonymously, described a night that stayed with him. He'd been running a standard flight path, high over the desert, when his instruments picked up a blip. At first, he thought it was nothing. Then the blip moved, not just moved, darted, covered impossible distance in an instant. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. You tell yourself it was equipment, he said later, that something glitched, but deep down, you know better. You know what you saw. You just can't explain it. All of these accounts, scattered and quiet, formed a kind of mosaic, a pattern of the unexplained that stretched across decades. And when Lazar began speaking, cautiously at first, then with growing detail, those stories found a kind of reluctant validation in the quiet corners of small-town diners, over beers in dimly lit bars. People began to talk, to connect the dots, to share their own encounters in low voices, careful not to attract too much attention, but unable to keep the memories entirely to themselves. There was a man named Tom, a rancher whose property bordered restricted land. He'd lived there for years, knew every inch of his land, every sound the desert made, and yet, one night, he woke to a hum, low, steady, almost like the thrum of distant machinery. He stepped outside, expecting to find a truck on the road, maybe some equipment running somewhere nearby. Instead, he found the desert, still silent, except for the hum. Looking up, he saw a tan object, low enough that he could make out its shape, smooth, round, no lights, no markings. It hovered for a moment, just long enough for him to be sure of what he was seeing, and then, without warning, it shot upward, vanishing into the night with a speed that made his heart pound. I didn't tell anyone for a long time, Tom admitted years later. You don't want to be that guy, you know? the one people whisper about. But when I heard Lazar talk, when I heard him describe those crafts, I knew I wasn't crazy. For every story that reached the surface, there were dozens that never did. People who saw, heard, or felt something, but kept it to themselves, out of fear, out of skepticism, or simply because they didn't think anyone would believe them. And maybe that was the strangest part of it all, that so many people, across so many years, had quietly shared the same sense of quiet awe, the same soft hum of the unexplained, threading through their lives. For Lazar, these voices became a kind of background chorus to his own experience. He didn't seek them out, but they found him, people wanting to share, to unburden themselves of memories that had lingered too long in the quiet spaces of their minds. And as the stories accumulated, a strange kind of community formed, not loud, not public, but steady. People who, in the silence of the desert night, had all looked up and seen something they couldn't quite name. What none of them could know then was that the silence was beginning to crack, and soon what had been quiet whispers in diners and around kitchen tables would spill into something much larger. The world, whether it was ready or not, was about to hear their voices. It started quietly, not with headlines, not with television cameras, but with a handful of men meeting in hushed corners, following threads that most people didn't even know were there. In those early days, the idea of investigating Area 51 was almost laughable. The base was a ghost, a place that officially didn't even exist. Its location wasn't marked on any map. Its name wasn't acknowledged in any government document. And yet, somehow, everyone in the desert seemed to know it was there, humming, alive, doing something beyond their reach. The first real push came from a man named George Knapp, a young investigative reporter who'd built his career chasing stories most people ignored. He wasn't looking for aliens. He wasn't even particularly interested in the desert. But when whispers of Lazar's claims reached him, there was something in them that felt different, something quiet but undeniable, like the low hum of a storm building on the horizon. Knapp started with what little he had, a name, a few scattered statements, and a location deep in the Nevada desert. It wasn't much, but it was enough to plant a question he couldn't ignore. Who was Bob Lazar, really? And more importantly, was there any way to prove that what he was saying wasn't just the stuff of late-night conspiracy theories? The deeper Knapp dug, the stranger it got. Official records seemed to vanish where Lazar's name should have been. No university transcripts, no employment history. It was as though someone had gone through and carefully, methodically erased entire chapters of a man's life. And yet, there were cracks at Los Alamos, where Lazar claimed to have worked. There was no official acknowledgement of his employment. But in an old phone directory, his name appeared listed plainly among the scientists. A photograph surfaced too, grainy but clear enough. Bob, standing near a piece of advanced lab equipment, proof that, at the very least, he had been there. For Knapp, that was enough to keep going. Meanwhile, others began to take notice. Amateur researchers, aviation buffs, people who'd spent years watching the skies over Groom Lake, cataloging strange flight paths and unexplained lights. To them, Lazar's story wasn't fantasy, it was validation. One of those early researchers was a man named John Lear, a former pilot and the son of the inventor of the Learjet. Lear had his own theories, wild ones, by most standards, but he had contacts and he had an ear for stories that didn't fit the official line. When Lazar appeared in his orbit, Lear recognized immediately that something unusual was happening. Together, Knapp, Lear, and a handful of others began piecing together a puzzle no one else had dared to touch. They tracked aircraft. They followed paper trails, however faint. They talked to locals, ranchers, gas station attendants, truckers, people who had seen things but had long since stopped talking about them, and slowly a picture began to form. It wasn't complete, it wasn't even clear, but it was enough to suggest that somewhere deep in the restricted desert, something extraordinary was happening. Then there were the Wednesday night tests. Lazar had mentioned them almost offhandedly, but for those paying attention, they were a revelation. According to him, flights were scheduled on specific night slate after most of the world had gone to bed. If you knew where to look, and if you were patient, you might catch a glimpse of something you weren't supposed to see. So they went, Knapp, Lear, a few others, driving deep into the desert, parking in spots locals had pointed out, waiting under a wide, starless sky. And on more than one occasion, they saw them bright, darting lights that moved in ways no human aircraft could. Lights that hovered, darted, and vanished in an instant, leaving behind nothing but the echo of their own disbelief. It was, for the investigators, a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. They were getting closer, yes, but closer to what, exactly? The more Lazar talked, the more the danger seemed to grow. There were unmarked cars following him at odd hours, calls on his home phone that ended the moment he picked up. Once, he came home to find that his house had been broken into, nothing stolen, but papers disturbed, drawers opened. For Knapp, the lines blurred quickly. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was something larger, something that felt dangerous, in ways he couldn't quite articulate. And still, they kept going. They gathered affidavits, recorded interviews, slowly built a body of evidence that suggested, at the very least, that Lazar believed what he was saying. At night, under the vast desert sky, they'd sit and talk about propulsion systems, about government secrets, about what it might mean if even a fraction of what Lazar described was real. The investigation began to take on a life of its own, drawing in people who would, in time, become legends in their own right in the strange, shadowy world of UFO research. But for all the attention, for all the effort, there was always the same wall, the base itself. Groom Lake, Area 51. Whatever name you gave it, it remained impenetrable. From the ridges miles away, they could see the faint glow of lights. They could hear the distant hum of activity. But the fences, the cameras, and the armed patrols kept everyone firmly on the outside. And maybe that was what made it so powerful, not just what was known, but what couldn't be known. The sense that just beyond that line, beyond the dry scrub and endless sand, something world-changing was unfolding. Knapp would later describe those days as a strange mix of fear and wonder. Every new lead felt like a victory, every small confirmation a reason to keep pushing. And yet, there was always the sense that they were treading in waters far deeper than they realized. By the time the first televised interview aired, Lazar's face obscured, his voice distorted. The investigation had already taken on a quiet momentum of its own. People who had never spoken before were suddenly calling in, sharing their own stories, their own quiet encounters with things they couldn't explain. And with each new voice, the silence surrounding Area 51 grew thinner, but it was also becoming clear that this wasn't just about lights in the sky or strange craft on radar screens. It was about something far more human, the lengths to which power will go to keep its secrets, and the quiet courage of those willing to risk everything to bring even a sliver of truth into the light. For the investigators, there was no turning back. The desert, once just a backdrop, had become a living, breathing character in its own right, a place where the ordinary rules didn't quite apply, where the line between the known and the unknown blurred just enough to keep them coming back. And somewhere deep inside that forbidden space, the story they were chasing pulsed like a hidden heartbeat, steady and relentless, waiting for the moment when the world would finally be forced to look. By the time the interviews began to circulate, first whispered about, then replayed on late-night radio and early cable news, the public was primed for something extraordinary. But nothing could quite prepare anyone for what came next. Bob Lazar's description of the technology itself, it wasn't vague. It wasn't the language of conspiracy theory. It was meticulous, technical, and confident, as though he'd spent long nights in a lab staring at machines most people could barely imagine. And maybe he had. Lazar claimed that deep within a hidden facilities for a series of hangars burrowed into the base of a ridge near Groom Lake, there were 9 craft, 9 saucers, each one slightly different, as though they had been collected over time, maybe from different places, maybe even from different worlds. To the investigators, and to anyone who cared to listen, the first question was obvious. Were these human-made advanced prototypes some secret military breakthrough decades ahead of its time? But Lazar was clear. They weren't ours. The first time he walked into the hangar, he said it was almost surreal. He expected wires, scaffolding, maybe men in white coats. Instead, the craft sat there silently, perfectly formed, as though they'd been grown rather than built. Their surfaces were seamless, smooth to the point of impossibility. No rivets, no welds, no visible controls, just quiet, waiting machines, and at the heart of it, all what Lazar would later describe as the real miracle was the power source, element 115. At the time, the periodic table had no such entry. The idea of a stable, usable element at that atomic weight was, according to mainstream science, impossible. But Lazar insisted the technology ran on something beyond what humanity had yet produced, a fuel so potent that a single small reactor could generate massive amounts of clean energy without heat, without radiation, without waste. To demonstrate the principle, Lazar sketched out the basics of what he said he'd seen. The reactors worked by amplifying gravity waves, bending space itself, creating a localized distortion that allowed the craft to fall toward its destination. It wasn't propulsion in the way we understood it. It was manipulation to anyone with a basic understanding of physics. It sounded like fantasy, but Lazar spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had sat in the briefings, read the technical notes, and been close enough to touch the machines themselves. And there were details, small ones, but convincing in their way. The interior of the craft was designed for beings smaller than humans, he said. The chairs, the doorways, the workstations, everything suggested operators roughly 3 feet tall. There were no sharp edges, no angles, only smooth curves, as If the entire interior had been molded from a single material, when Knapp aired these revelations, the reaction was electric. Skeptics dismissed it as a hoax. Believers hailed it as proof. And the quiet hum around Area 51 became a roar, with reporters, researchers, and curiosity seekers descending on the Nevada desert in numbers the sleepy towns nearby had never seen. But for Lazar, the cost was immediate. The government, he claimed, was not pleased. There were more break-ins, more strange vehicles parked just out of sight. He described being followed, being warned, even being threatened. And though there was never open violence, the message was clear enough. Stop talking. What made his claims so enduring, though, wasn't just the drama of the story, it was the way some of it, slowly, quietly, began to check out. In the years that followed, scientists would confirm the existence of element 115, later named Moscovium. It wasn't stable in the way Lazar described, not in the small samples we could produce, but its mere existence gave weight to a claim that had died for years, been dismissed outright. Other details, too, found strange echoes in the real world. Patents filed by defense contractors for gravity-based propulsion systems. Declassified documents hinting at advanced aerospace research dating back decades. And sightings, always the sightings of craft that moved in ways that defied explanation. For the small but growing network of investigators, researchers, and true believers, it was vindication. Not proof, not yet, but enough to keep them digging, enough to keep the story alive long after most people would have let it fade. What fascinated them most wasn't just the possibility of alien life, was the implications of the technology itself. Clean, limitless energy, gravity manipulation, travel that defied the constraints of time and distance. If even a fraction of what Lazar described was real, it could change everything: transportation, energy, even the very way humans understood their place in the universe. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous idea of all, because if such technology existed, and if it was being studied, hidden, and controlled by a handful of people within a sprawling but secretive military-industrial complex, what did that mean for everyone else? What did it mean for a world still struggling with fossil fuels, with pollution, with the limits of current science? The questions piled up, and for many, they've never really been answered. Back in the desert, the rhythm continued. Night after night, people drove out to the ridges and dry lake beds, waiting for lights that might dart across the sky. Knapp kept digging. Lazar kept speaking carefully, cautiously, and the legend of Area 51 grew. It was no longer just a place. It was an idea, a symbol of secrecy and possibility, a riddle waiting to be solved. For those closest to the story, though, the fascination was always laced with unease. The technology, as Lazar described it, wasn't just advanced, it was dangerous. Mishandled, it could be catastrophic. And there were hints, almost throwaway comments, that at least one of the 9 craft had been damaged, possibly destroyed, during early testing. To imagine that kind of power locked away in the hands of a few was to wrestle with a kind of existential dread. What if it leaked? What if it was weaponized? What if it was never, ever shared? And so the investigation deepened. Scientists, engineers, and even former military personnel began to circle the story, some cautiously, some with open skepticism, but all drawn by the gravity, of what it suggested. What Lazar revealed wasn't just a story about aliens. It was a story about human ambition, about secrecy, and about the terrifying potential of knowledge kept out of reach. And in the quiet desert nights, as the lights flickered across the black expanse of sky, it was impossible not to feel that the truth, whatever it was, remained just beyond their grasp. Waiting. The desert has a way of keeping secrets. Its silence can feel eternal, swallowing evidence, swallowing voices, swallowing time itself. But for Bob Lazar, after the interviews aired, the desert was no longer quiet. It began with the feeling of being watched. At first, it was subtle, too subtle to be sure. A car that followed a little too closely on the long, empty stretch of highway home. A van parked across the street from his house, engine idling, lights off. He told himself it was nothing. Paranoia. The price of stepping into the spotlight with a story that was, at best, unbelievable. But then things escalated. He described his house being broken into drawers, rifled through, papers missing, even his phone line tapped. Friends he trusted said they'd seen men in suits, unmarked cars, faces they didn't recognize, hanging around. And the message was clear, though it was never spoken aloud: stop talking. The desert, which had once felt like a place of awe and wonder, now carried a different wet attention that hummed just below the surface, an invisible hand pressing against his back. For the government, the exposure had been embarrassing. Here was a man, credible enough to attract serious attention, making claims that could not easily be dismissed. And worse, the public was listening. By the late 1980s, Area 51 was no longer just a whisper shared between pilots and desert locals. It had become a headline. The once synonymous base was now a symbol of secrecy, of hidden truths, and of a government that might not be telling its people everything. For Lazar, the price was high. His credibility was attacked from every angle. His educational records, the places where he claimed to have studied, no trace. His employment history at Los Alamos erased. To the casual observer, it looked damning. If he really had degrees in physics, where were they? If he really had worked at a national laboratory, why wasn't there any paperwork? Why were there no records at all? And yet, there were cracks in the narrative that his detractors tried to build. People remembered him at Los Alamos. He'd been in the phone book as a staff member. There were photos, witnesses, and little pieces of evidence that hinted that someone was trying very hard to make him vanish on paper. If the intent was to make him look like a liar, it worked for many. Skeptics pounced, scientists scoffed, journalists painted him as a man seeking attention, spinning a story too wild to verify. But for others, the growing number of people camped in the desert at night, the amateur researchers trading notes in quiet corners of the early internet, had the opposite effect. If the story was false, why try so hard to erase him? Why break into his home? Why shadow him, intimidate him, silence him? And then there were the witnesses, people who lived near the base, workers who claimed to have seen strange lights, strange shapes, men who spoke carefully, anonymously, describing aircraft that moved in ways that defied conventional aerodynamics, starting, stopping, reversing direction, without any visible propulsion. It was as if Lazar's story had unlocked something in the public imagination, giving language to what many had seen but never understood. The government, of course, denied everything. Area 51 didn't officially exist. There were no aliens, no advanced craft, no. And for years, that was the official stance: stonewall, deny, deflect. But even as they denied it, they tightened their grip. Patrols around the base intensified. Signs went up, warning of deadly force. New layers of security were added. The message, to those who came too close physically or otherwise, was simple: stay away. The sense of pressure never fully let up. There were moments when he considered disappearing entirely, walking away, letting the story die, building a quiet life somewhere far from the desert. But there were also moments of stubborn resolve, a sense that the truth, whatever it was, deserved to be known. And so, cautiously, he kept talking, not loudly, not always publicly, but to those who would listen. He shared what he could about the craft, about the technology, about the way the world might change if even a fraction of what he'd seen were made available. For investigators like George Knapp, the story was a paradox. Every time they thought they'd reached the limit of what could be proven, another piece of the puzzle surfaced: a document, a witness, a strange report buried in government archives. Enough to keep them chasing the truth, never enough to settle it. The official version of events hardened. Lazar was a hoaxer. Area 51 was just a testing ground for advanced military aircraft. The lights in the desert were experimental planes, nothing more. And yet, the years rolled on, and the evidence didn't disappear. Footage surfaced of strange craft maneuvering at impossible speeds. Whistleblowers from within the defense industry hinted carefully at programs decades ahead of what the public knew. In 2013, under pressure, the CIA finally acknowledged what everyone already knew: Area 51 existed. What they didn't acknowledge was what everyone wanted to know: what exactly was being hidden there. For those following Lazar's story, that silence spoke volumes, and in the meantime, the legend grew. The desert towns near the base Rachel Alamo, Jacob became meccas for the curious, for the believers, for those who wanted to stand under the same stars and wonder. Tourism boomed. Books were written. Movies were made. Area 51, once nameless, became a cultural icon. But for Lazar, none of that was a victory. The cost had been too high. His career in science was over, his reputation in ruins, his private life fractured by the relentless scrutiny, the quiet but unrelenting pressure. And through it all, the question lingered: was it worth it? Those close to him say that even now, he rarely watches interviews of himself from those early days. He doesn't like revisiting it. The nervous young man sitting across from Knapp, carefully choosing his words, trying to explain something almost too large to comprehend. But when pressed, when asked if he would do it again, the answer has always been the same: yes. Because for Lazar, it was never about fame. It was about the truth, or, at least, about what he believed to be the truth. And maybe that's why, decades later, his story still resonates. Because at its core, it isn't just about aliens or technology or the desert night sky. It's about a man who risked everything to tell what he knew, and about a government that seemed determined to make him regret it. In the quiet hours of the night, when the desert is still and the stars stretch endless across the black, it's hard not to think of him there alone, staring out into the vastness, wondering if the truth will ever really come to light. For most people, the story of Bob Lazar should have faded with time. The interviews should have been forgotten, the grainy footage archived, the man dismissed as another eccentric with a wild tale. That's what usually happens. The news cycle moves on, the world finds other stories, and the desert swallows its secrets again. But this story refused to die. It clung to the edges of public consciousness like a burr on a jacket, and every few years some sighting, some leaked report, some offhand government admission would pull it right back into the spotlight. The first thread that kept it alive was the people. Ordinary men and women who swore they'd seen something in that desert sky long before Lazar ever went public. There had been stories, strange lights dancing silently over the test ranges, craft that darted and hovered and shot away faster than anything known to man. Pilots whispered about it. Locals pointed to the sky at night. Truckers who drove those lonely desert roads told stories they could never quite explain. And when Lazar started talking, those quiet, private stories had a name. They had context. Suddenly, those witnesses weren't just seeing lights, they were seeing proof. Then came the photographs. Blurry, shaky, hard to analyze, but compelling. And later, the videos. Shapes that moved in ways that conventional aircraft simply couldn't. At first, skeptics waved them away. Grainy footage could be faked. Eyewitness accounts could be explained away as weather balloons or optical illusions. But the trickle never stopped. In 1994, a strange series of radar readings was reported over the desert. In the Erlit-Fu, thousands pilots, highly trained, credible men began coming forward with their own experiences. They described objects with no wings, no visible propulsion, no exhaust, performing maneuvers that defied every known law of physics. By the time the Pentagon quietly confirmed the existence of a secret program investigating unidentified aerial phenomena, the conversation had shifted. What had once been conspiracy theory had inched closer to unexplained phenomena. And every time that happened, Lazar's story was dragged out again, dissected, replayed, reconsidered. It wasn't just the sightings. It was the little, inexplicable coincidences that gave his claims a strange sort of credibility. Take Element 115, for example. When Lazar first spoke about it, he described it as the key to the alien propulsion system, an element that, at the time, didn't officially exist. Scientists scoffed. It sounded like science fiction, the stuff of pulp novels and Saturday morning serials. But then, years later, the element was synthesized in a lab. It was unstable, yes. It didn't have the properties Lazar had described. But the fact that it existed at all, that this man had named it specifically, long before it was recognized, was enough to make some people pause. Coincidence? Maybe, but coincidences piled up. There were witnesses who remembered seeing him at Los Alamos, even when official records claimed he had never been there. There were colleagues who recalled casual conversations that, in hindsight, seemed to line up with the things he would later reveal. And there were the attempts to erase him, the missing records, the quiet pressure, the way his life had been turned upside down after going public. If the goal was to silence him, it failed. If the goal was to discredit him, it backfired, because the harder the push to make Lazar disappear, the more people believed that he had touched a nerve, that his story was closer to the truth than anyone wanted to admit. Then, as the internet grew, the legend found fertile ground. Forums lit up with debate. Amateurs pored over satellite imagery, combing the desert for clues. Theories multiplied, each more elaborate than the last. And through it all, the core story remained. A young physicist brought in to study something that wasn't supposed to exist, who walked away with secrets too big to keep. Thetpool 1010 brought a new wave of validation, not proof, but validation. The Pentagon videos, the admission in careful, bureaucratic language that there were objects in our skies behaving in ways we couldn't explain. For those who had followed the story from the beginning, it was like watching the edges of a curtain slowly lift just enough to show a sliver of what lay behind it. Even some skeptics began to shift. They didn't necessarily buy every detail of Lazar's story, but they couldn't dismiss the mounting evidence that something was there, that the government was, at the very least, aware of phenomena far beyond the reach of public science. And through it all, Lazar himself never wavered. Decades passed, trends changed, UFOs became UAPs. The culture moved on to other obsessions. But, asked in interviews or in the rare public appearances he agreed to, his story stayed the same. He didn't embellish. He didn't add dramatic new details. He just repeated what he had always said in the same measured, quiet tone. For many, that consistency is what made him believable. Hoaxers usually crave attention. They escalate, they adapt, they feed off the spotlight. Lazar seemed almost burdened by his. He never capitalized on it the way others might have. No book tours, no speaking circuits, no sensational claims designed to keep his name in the headlines. Just the same steady story. And that, perhaps more than anything, is why the evidence, the real evidence, the circumstantial evidence, and the whispered hints has never truly gone away. It's why, decades later, people still drive out to the black mailbox in the Nevada desert, still gather near the perimeter of a base that technically doesn't exist, still stand in the quiet and look up at a sky that has seen things we can't explain. Because deep down, the question remains, what if he was telling the truth? What if buried somewhere beneath those layers of security and silence, there really are machines that don't come from here? What if the breakthroughs we dream about, limitless energy, gravity manipulation, interstellar travel, are not dreams at all, but technologies already in our possession, locked away where only a few will ever see them? It's a question that lingers, one that refuses to fade. And maybe that's why the story still matters, not because of what it proves, but because of what it represents. The possibility that the world is bigger, stranger, and far more extraordinary than we've been led to believe, even now. When skeptics roll their eyes and scientists dismiss it, the evidence thin, scattered, circumstantial still hums in the background like a low, steady frequency. A story that should have died 100 times over keeps breathing. And in the stillness of the desert night, with the mountains silhouetted against 1,000 unblinking stars, you can almost feel it's that sense that somewhere out there, something is moving, silent and impossible, waiting for the moment when secrecy is no longer an option. By the late 1990s, Bob Lazar was no longer just a man with a strange story. He was an icon of a cultural shift that no one had quite seen coming. What began as a fringe tale whispered among nighttime radio listeners had exploded into something bigger. It wasn't just conspiracy theorists and UFO enthusiasts anymore. Lazar's name had become a symbol, a touchstone for anyone who ever felt that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't exactly as it appeared. Movies picked up the imagery, television shows borrowed his ideas. Books, fiction and non-fiction, alike sprinkled in references to secret bases, reverse-engineered alien craft, and shadowy government programs. The concept of Area 51 went from obscure jargon to a household phrase, woven into the language of popular culture, and with it came the slow, steady erosion of skepticism. Because here's the thing about a story that resonates: it plants seeds. Even in the minds of those who laugh it off, the idea lingers. What if? What if it's true? What if there really are things out there we're not supposed to know about? By the time shows like The X-Files hit their stride, Lazar's narrative had already primed the collective imagination. Suddenly, the image of a shadow government hiding world-changing secrets wasn't absurd. It was entertainment. It was exciting. And, for some, it was believable. The cultural shockwave wasn't confined to fiction, either. Communities began to form small at first, then sprawling as the internet gave people a place to gather, to share stories, to trade theories, and to scrutinize every blurry photograph and shaky video frame by frame. Forums lit up with debates, message boards filled with speculation. People who had never met, living thousands of miles apart, found each other in this shared fascination with the unexplained. For some, it was harmless curiosity, hobby, a way to pass the time. But for others, it became something deeper. It became belief. The belief that they weren't crazy for thinking the world might be bigger and stranger than they'd been told. The belief that someone, somewhere, was keeping the truth from them, and belief is powerful. Governments and institutions that had, for decades, dismissed all talk of UFOs as nonsense began to notice the shift. They saw the rising tide of interest, the way ordinary people, pilots, police officers, even military personnel, were starting to come forward with their own stories. It was no longer just a fringe topic. It was mainstream, and with that mainstream attention came pressure. Pressure for answers. Pressure for acknowledgement. But the answers never quite came, at least not in full. Instead, there were drips, leaks, carefully worded statements. Enough to keep the fire burning. Never enough to satisfy the hunger for truth. And so the legend grew. By the early 2000s, the name Area 51 was synonymous with secrecy. Tours were organized to the edges of the Nevada desert. The black mailbox became a pilgrimage site. People camped on the outskirts, scanning the skies with cameras and telescopes, hoping for a glimpse of something extraordinary. And through it all, Lazar kept to himself, while others capitalized on the frenzy, writing books, selling merchandise, doing talk show circuits. Lazar seemed almost reluctant to participate. He would grant the occasional interview, but he never sought out the spotlight. That reluctance, paradoxically, made him even more compelling, because in a world full of noise and exaggeration, his quiet consistency felt too many like authenticity. Then came the internet's second wave. YouTube, social media, instant sharing. The story found a new generation. Teenagers who hadn't even been born when Lazar first spoke out were now dissecting his claims, analyzing old footage, and debating his credibility in comment sections and live streams. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement, and movements have a way of seeping into everything. Look closely, and you see the fingerprints everywhere. In music videos, in late-night comedy sketches, in memes shared millions of times. Even people who didn't know Lazar's name knew the imagery, the alien head, the top secret stamp, the faded photos of strange shapes in a desert sky. But with cultural saturation came distortion. The original story, the one Lazar told, in his quiet, almost reluctant tone, became tangled in exaggerations and outright fabrications. People added details, twisted timelines, invented new conspiracies that Lazar himself never claimed. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about reverse-engineered alien craft, it was about underground cities, interstellar treaties, and secret bases on the moon. And yet, in the midst of that noise, the core story, the strange, quiet, unsettling story Lazar told, never lost its pull, because it wasn't just about aliens at its heart. It was about trust. Trust in institutions, trust in authority, trust in the idea that the people in charge would tell the truth if the truth were big enough to change the world. When that trust wavered, when people saw cracks in the facade, Lazar's story fit perfectly into the gap. Maybe that's why the cultural impact was so profound. It wasn't about proving that aliens were real. It was about proving that we didn't know everything we thought we knew, and that those who claimed to have all the answers might not be as honest as they appeared. By the Latet Pu 2010, that shift in perception had reached the highest levels. When the Pentagon finally acknowledged the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena, when Navy pilots spoke openly about their encounters, when videos were released showing objects defying every known law of physics, something fundamental changed. The laughter stopped. What had once been the punchline of late-night jokes was now a topic of serious discussion in newsrooms, in government briefings, even in scientific journals. And once again, the name Lazar resurfaced, not because anyone had definitively proven him right, but because so much of what he had said decades earlier now seemed less impossible, less absurd. The cultural shockwave he helped ignite had grown into a global conversation, one that showed no signs of slowing down, and in quiet corners of the internet, in forums and podcasts and late-night live streams, that conversation always circles back to the same haunting question. What if, after all this time, he was telling the truth? Beneath the storm of headlines, documentaries, and endless speculation, there was always one constant: Bob Lazar himself, the man who, 1989, stepped in front of a news camera with George Knapp and claimed to have worked on alien technology at a secret government site, was never the kind of figure you'd expect to spark a global phenomenon. He wasn't polished. He wasn't a skilled public speaker. He didn't carry himself like a man chasing fame or fortune. And that, ironically, is what kept him believable for so many. Because when you strip away the noise, the myth, and the decades of cultural buildup, you're left with something deceptively simple: a quiet, almost reluctant witness to something he claims he never wanted to see in the first place. Lazar never fit the archetype of a whistleblower. He didn't write a book when he could have. He didn't go on talk shows to soak up applause. He didn't start a speaking tour to cash in on the UFO craze. Instead, after the initial explosion of attention, he disappeared for years at a time. There were no interviews, no statements, no attempts to reclaim the spotlight. He focused on his small business or scientific supply company in Michigan and tried, as best he could, to live an ordinary life. But for someone like Lazar, ordinary was never really possible, because while he withdrew, the world around him changed. His name turned into a kind of shorthand a reference point for anyone who suspected that what we see isn't all there is. His story grew bigger than him, beyond his ability, or perhaps his desire to control. And yet, whenever he did reappear, he was always the same, soft-spoken, measured, almost weary. When pressed, he would repeat his story in the same flat, consistent tone. The details never changed. The phrasing barely shifted. It was as though he had locked that part of his life into a box and, when asked, would simply open it, take out the same careful words, and put them back when the conversation ended. That consistency has been one of the strangest and most compelling parts of the Lazar phenomenon, because, over decades, people usually slip, they embellish, they contradict themselves. But Lazar never did. His story remained frustratingly static, too detailed to dismiss outright, too extraordinary to prove beyond doubt. And that static nature only deepened the mystery. Was it the sign of a man telling the truth, unshaken by time and scrutiny? Or was it the mark of someone disciplined enough to maintain a lie for a lifetime? People debated endlessly, and still do, to those who knew him personally. Lazar wasn't a man obsessed with UFOs or fame. He was a scientist, a tinkerer, a man more interested in building particle accelerators in his garage than in chasing conspiracy theories. Friends described him as curious, brilliant, and deeply private, a man uncomfortable with attention, but too stubborn to retract what he believed was the truth. And there were moments, fleeting, quiet moments, that hinted at the toll it all took. The raids on his businesses, the scrutiny of his background, his education, his credentials, the endless accusations, the whispers, the online forums dissecting his every word, the weight of being the man at the center of a storm he never seemed to want. Through it all, Lazar never lashed out, never tried to silence his critics, never demanded belief. Instead, he adopted a kind of quiet resignation. "This is what I saw," he would say. "This is what I worked on. You can believe it or not. It doesn't matter. It's what happened." And maybe that was part of what made him so enigmatic. Because in a world where almost everyone is selling something, an idea, a book, a brand, here was a man who seemed to be selling nothing at all. That absence of a motive became, paradoxically, a motive in itself in the minds of those who believed him. Why would he lie? They'd ask. What does he have to gain? But skeptics saw it differently. They pointed to inconsistencies in his educational record, to the lack of verifiable evidence that he ever worked at Los Alamos, to the possibility that he was a skilled fabricator of scientific-sounding details that kept his story just plausible enough to survive. And so the debate raged year after year, decade after decade. Even now, more than 30 years after that first interview, Bob Lazar exists in a strange kind of limbo, neither fully vindicated nor fully discredited. And maybe that's why his story endures, because in that limbo, people can project their own beliefs, their own doubts, their own fears and hopes. To believers, he is the quiet prophet of a hidden truth. To skeptics, he is a cautionary tale of how a single story can spiral into a cultural phenomenon. But to Lazar himself, he has always seemed, in his own words and actions, like a man caught in a current he never meant to step into. And maybe that's the most human part of all this, that at the center of the myth, at the center of the endless speculation and the documentaries and the late-night debates, there is simply a man, a man who says he saw something, a man who by speaking that truth, whatever it was, changed the way we talk about secrecy, about trust, about the boundaries of what we think we know. Even now, when Lazar appears in interviews, there's a quiet sadness in his voice. Not melodrama, not self-pity, just the kind of weariness that comes from a lifetime of carrying a story too big to ever truly set down. And yet, when asked the simplest question, would you do it again? His answer is always the same. Yes, he says. Because some things, he believes, are too important to keep hidden, no matter the cost. That quiet resolve, that stubborn thread of conviction, is what keeps the legend alive. Because for all the theories, for all the speculation, for all the noise that has built up around his name, Bob Lazar remains exactly what he was the day he first spoke out. A man with a story that refuses to die. For all the documentaries, interviews, and debates that have surrounded Bob Lazar for more than 3 decades, one thing has never changed: the questions. They hang in the air like static, heavy, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. Because whether you believe Lazar's story or dismiss it entirely, the gaps in our understanding remain. And those gaps, more than anything else, are what keep people awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what's out there and what we've been told or not told about it. The first question is always the simplest and the most profound. Was he telling the truth? If you strip away the noise, that's the core of it. Either Bob Lazar was a whistleblower who risked everything to tell the world that the U.S. government was in possession of alien technology, or he wasn't. And if he wasn't, then how did his story survive this long? Because hoaxes fade, conspiracies unravel, people slip up, or evidence surfaces, or time erases the illusion. But with Lazar, that never happened. The details of his story never shifted. The tone of his interviews never changed. He never released a book to capitalize on the fame, never launched a speaking tour, never tried to turn his story into a brand. And maybe that's why his name, even now, carries weight. But if he was telling the truth, that raises questions, even bigger than the man himself. What happened to the technology he claimed to have worked on? Where are the crafts now? Who holds the keys to technology so advanced it could rewrite the laws of physics as we understand them? And why, after all these years, has nothing, no official acknowledgement, no leaked evidence, no irrefutable proof, ever surfaced? Those questions are what make Lazar's story so maddening, even for his staunchest supporters. Because in a world where everything leaks, where secrets slip out in texts and emails and anonymous tips, somehow this one, if it's true, has remained perfectly sealed. And that leads to the second great question. What if we're not ready to know? It's an unsettling thought, but one that comes up again and again among people who study these stories. What if the reason the government hasn't revealed the truth isn't because they're hiding something malicious, but because they genuinely believe we can't handle it? What would it mean for religion, for politics, for global stability, if we knew without doubt that we are not alone? Would the world unite under that revelation, or would it fracture even further? And if that's the calculation being made behind closed doors, then Lazar's story isn't just a tale about alien spacecraft. It's a glimpse at a moral dilemma that's as human as it is cosmic. But then there's the third question, the one skeptics can never quite shake. What if none of this is real? What if Lazar is exactly what his critics say? He is a man who fabricated his credentials, who wove together bits of scientific jargon and popular UFO lore into a story so compelling that it took on a life of its own. If that's the case, then his story becomes something else entirely, not a revelation of hidden truths, but a mirror held up to our collective hopes and fears, because maybe what we really want, more than proof, is the possibility that we are not alone, that somewhere out there, beyond the noise and the chaos of this small blue planet, there's something greater, something that might explain where we came from, where we're going, and why we're here at all. And maybe that's why Lazar's story, true or not, will never die, because it taps into something primal, something older than science or religion. The need to know, the need to believe that there is more to the universe than what we can see with our own eyes. Even scientists, those trained to be skeptical, to demand evidence, have admitted as much. Carl Sagan once said, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." But he also acknowledged that the size and age of the universe make it almost certain that life exists somewhere beyond Earth. And so we keep looking. The telescopes scan the skies. The scientists sift through radio waves, searching for patterns. Pilots report strange objects they can't explain. Military footage leaks, showing craft that move in ways no human technology should. And every time something like that happens, every time the mystery deepens instead of disappearing, Lazar's story surges back into the conversation. Because whether you believe him or not, his claims created a kind of framework, a language for thinking about things we don't yet understand. And maybe that's why, after all these years, the biggest question of all still hangs in the air. What if he was right? What if, in the deserts of Nevada, in the shadows of a base that officially didn't exist, a quiet, unassuming man really did work on something that wasn't of this earth? If that's true, then everything changes. Our understanding of physics, our place in the universe, the very story we tell ourselves about what it means to be human, and maybe, just maybe, that's why the story endures. Not because we need to believe in Bob Lazar the man, but because we need to believe in the possibility that the world is bigger, stranger, and more wondrous than we've been told. In the end, that's what makes the unanswered questions so powerful, because they don't just belong to Lazar anymore. They belong to all of us. Every time you look up at the night sky and wonder what's out there, every time you see a story about unexplained aerial phenomena and feel that twinge of curiosity, every time you imagine a universe where we are not alone, the questions linger, and maybe they always will, because some stories, true or not, become part of the fabric of who we are. And Bob Lazar's story, with all its mystery and contradictions, with all its skepticism and belief, is one of those stories. It is, in its own strange way, a kind of modern mythology, reminder that even in an age of information, there are still things we don't understand, still horizons we haven't reached, still questions we can't answer. And maybe that's the real legacy of Bob Lazar. The crafts he claimed to see, not the technology he claimed to touch, but the way his story cracked open the door, just a little, to the vast unknown beyond. The night has grown quiet now, as though the world itself is holding its breath. The story we've traced from whispered accounts under dark skies, through the quiet courage of witnesses, to the careful analysis of experts and skeptics lingers like an echo. And as we rest here, at the edge of what can be known, one truth remains: the mystery is still with us, soft and patient, waiting for the next curious mind to wander its paths. Perhaps that's what draws us to these stories, the quiet allure of the unknown. For some, it's the thrill of discovery, the hope that one day there will be an answer. For others, it's simply the comfort of mystery itself. A reminder that the world is still full of places where logic falters, where wonder breathes, and where possibility has not yet been boxed in by certainty. When you think of the witnesses, those ordinary men and women, farmers and teachers, mechanics and children, who stepped outside on quiet nights and saw something they couldn't explain, you may sense that they weren't so different from you. They were simply living their lives, moving through their days, unaware that a single moment would shift the way they saw the sky forever. It is in that shared humanity that the story finds its power. The craft, the lights, the beings, whatever they were or are, seem almost secondary to the shared experience of awe and confusion. And maybe that is the thread that ties every one of these encounters together, a reminder that we are all part of something bigger, something vast and humbling. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that night sky again, the soft sweep of stars above, the cool stillness of the air, the quiet hum of the earth beneath your feet. You don't need to see a craft streaking across the heavens to feel that sense of wonder. It's there, woven into the silence of the universe, waiting for anyone willing to pause and look up. As the decades pass, evidence will come and go. Reports will be written, debunked, rediscovered, and debated again. New technologies will scan the skies, and new stories will emerge from corners of the world that have yet to be heard. But the core of this mystery, the question of who or what might share this universe with us, remains untouched by time. Perhaps one day the answers will be clear, undeniable, or perhaps the mystery will remain, not to be solved, but simply to be experienced. A reminder that in a world where so much is explained and catalogued, there are still places where wonder is alive, and maybe that's enough. Because in the end, it's not just about what is out there. It's also about what these mysteries awaken in us: curiosity, humility, a quiet sense of awe. They invite us to think beyond ourselves, beyond the narrow span of a human lifetime, and into the endless expanse that stretches far beyond what we know. So, as you drift toward sleep, let these thoughts settle in gently, like leaves floating down a still river. Let the noise of the day fade away, leaving only the soft hum of possibility. Somewhere out there, in the quiet vastness of the cosmos, there may be answers. And maybe one day, those answers will find their way to us. But for now, it is enough to rest here in the mystery. The stars will keep their secrets a little while longer. And as you close your eyes, perhaps you'll carry with you that same quiet wonder that filled those who first looked up and saw something extraordinary, something they could not name, but something they would never forget. Rest now. Let the questions wait for another night. The mystery isn't going anywhere.